Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special live edition of In Conversation With. I'm very pleased that you're joining us this afternoon. My name is Shannon Salter, Deputy Minister to the Premier, Cabinet Secretary, and Head of the Public Service. And I'm broadcasting today live from the territory of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations here in downtown Victoria. With me for today's conversation are two very special guests, neither of whom probably need any introduction, but I'll introduce them anyway. And I'm so excited for the conversation we're about to have. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jen Pahlka, author, co-founder of Code for America, political advisor, just to name a few of her roles. And of course, our very own CJ Ritchie, Associate Deputy Minister and Government Chief Information Officer with the Ministry of Citizen Services. Welcome, both of you. Now, before I turn it over to Jen and CJ to introduce themselves, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items. CART captioning is available in this meeting. The moderation team behind the scenes has posted the URL for accessing CART transcription in the announcements. So please follow the link to access the service. We also have a question and answer panel for today. So start thinking about your questions and comments. Really keen to hear from you. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function enabled in Teams, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as possible. A note on accessibility. We're aware that some assistive technology, including Dragon voice control and dictation software, isn't fully compatible with Teams live event. That said, we're doing user testing in action because we had one of our Amazing Start employees who uses this software test it with us, and they confirmed that while full text control is not available, Dragon users can use the Q&A chat for question submission. So hopefully that's helpful. Moderators are adding some information now in the chat about how to use Dragon's mouse grid commands in case that's helpful. And then finally, if you experience any technical issues, please access the backup link that should be included with your calendar invite. Okay, that's it for housekeeping. So with that out of the way, I just want to briefly set the stage for this conversation, and I hope we did this in the promos as well, to say that this might seem like a conversation about technology and coding, and I know from talking to a number of you, that is the kind of thing that lights your heart on fire. But if that's not you, don't worry. This is really also a conversation about culture and what kind of culture we need to build in our organization so that we can continue to deliver the services and the programs that British Columbians rely on, and continue to do that in a way that really puts users in the center, that gives them timely, understandable, useful information and tools. So that's what today is all about. And the good news for all of us is we all have a role to play in making that culture a reality here in the BC Public Service. So no one better positioned to be able to share their experience on this than Jen and CJ. And with that, I'll hand things over to Jen. Jen, can you tell us a little bit about the genesis for this book? How did this book come to be? And sorry, the book I should say is Recoding America, but I think everybody in the public service now knows that with all of our promo work.
Thank you for advertising the book. I'm very appreciative, but I'm also really honored and delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, the book really came out of a desire to support the people who are doing great delivery work, and a recognition that, you know, after 10 years of working with teams that were trying to deliver better for the American people, and I think to some degree Canadians. I've had some exposure to your wonderful country and your wonderful public service. That we needed not just to sort of rally the troops to try harder, but really to work on the environment in which we're trying to deliver. And one of those pieces of that environment is that, you know, policy and delivery are really seen as very separate things, and want to bring them together because I think there's just enormous evidence that these are not really separate domains now in 2024, and that distance is actually the source of a lot of the problems. And I think when we think about it that way, and I think there's, you know, other ways to express that, we start to create an environment in which these teams can deliver what they know they need to deliver a lot more easily. So HR needs to keep up, procurement needs to keep up. It's not just delivery teams, it's everyone, and it's our legislatures. And if we can have a common conversation about that, that's where I really think we start to make more progress.
Well, I think that's something we can definitely relate to, and I think a number of folks in our audience can relate to. CJ, you've recently reread Recoding America, I know, because you and I have been chatting about it. Are there key takeaways that you've been thinking about in terms of what we should be implementing in our work, or really sort of specific things that employees should be thinking about as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so I've been the Government Chief Information Officer here for BC Government since 2018. And as you know, Shannon, have lots of opportunity to talk with CIOs in other jurisdictions. And what the book really did for me was spoke to me and reinforced the fact that this is not just a BC government issue. I know from talking to my colleagues across Canada, it is very much an issue in every jurisdiction. And reading Jen's book, it's obviously an issue south of the border as well. So that's heartening to know. I think BC in many ways is a leader in the digital space. I hear that from my colleagues across Canada. We use digital credentials in ways other jurisdictions do not. We have hundreds of applications on cloud, many of those built and supported in about a tenth of the cost. And we were able to weather the storm of the pandemic in ways other jurisdictions didn't, and lean into remote work using tools like we're using today, actually, to support employees. But there's lots more to do. And reading Jen's book reminds me of the conversation I have with colleagues all across the country in terms of what we're trying to do here is really, really hard. We still have about 40% of our applications in government are legacy applications. And often it's not the technology that's the hard part. It's the layers and layers of framework and culture and policy and procurement and all the things that surround that make it really hard, but really, really validating, valuable work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Jen, going back to your comment about the distance between policy and delivery, and really that those things, I think, in a modern world are much more entwined. I've often reflected that what we ask of our policy teams in government is really for them now to be more like a Swiss Army knife, and not to operate in a particular silo and then deliver that good policy work on to other teams. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you think the sort of prescription is for a modern approach to policy and service delivery?
When I worked at the White House, we were sort of advocating these build, measure, learn cycles, of course, for your delivery teams. And I had the great fortune to work with the head of Domestic Policy Council, Cecilia Munoz, who realized that, in fact, her policy team also could benefit from building, to working in these build, measure, learn cycles, and saw teams sort of come together around this. And so, yes, absolutely, I think Swiss Army knife is a great metaphor for it. I think we have for too long sort of just pretended that we work in this deterministic world in which if you do X, you're pretty sure that Y will happen. Any good service designer knows you better test that assumption. Yeah. And if we can test that assumption alongside a policy teammate or colleague, and maybe also an operations colleague, then we start to get the insight that we need to really write a policy that will deliver what that policymaker intended. And that just needs to happen with this much more effectively when the silos come down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a change in the way that the public expects to access government services too. And I think COVID really accelerated that. Is that something that you're seeing in your work as well, traveling around and learning about what other jurisdictions are doing? How has COVID changed people's expectations in this regard, and also the way that we work in government?
Yeah, I mean, COVID was a perfect example that a lot of the safeguards that we have in place really are less necessary than we thought. We did so many things so quickly during the pandemic because we had to. And I think one of the things I hear from lots of public servants is, now that the pandemic emergency is over, why are we returning to these ways of working when we really could question if it worked then and it was fine? Can't it continue to work that way? Can we work in a more streamlined way? Can we ask the question, is this safeguard or whatever it is really worth the trade-off of the extra time and extra layers of bureaucracy essentially that it brings? Speed really matters, particularly if, as I said before, you're trying to work in a build, measure, learn environment. If there's a lot of time between that measuring and then learning and then building again, your lessons get lost. And, a lot of times there's just stuff in the way that doesn't need to be in the way. And COVID really, really brought that to life. And I think it's sparked a lot of conversations about how things need to work in a non-emergency time. And I also saw a lot of public servants learning tools that they had never learned before. There's lots of low-code, no-code tools that people picked up and said, well, I can't hire a vendor right now to build this form that's maybe an application for rental assistance, but here's somebody who can help me learn to put it up all by myself, and that's what's going to happen in this emergency. And now, I as a public servant have this new skill that I'm going to use in so many different ways. And I think as terrible a time as it was, and I know that so many public servants just gave so much to the world during those years. I mean, really much more than we should ever have asked of our public servants. There are certain things that came out of it, I think, that people will carry with them in positive ways.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, our public service here in BC is no exception. Everybody went really above and beyond under really difficult circumstances and created things that are going to have that lasting impact, I think. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, so maybe I'll just turn to that. I'll start with just picking one here. In Jen's book, there are anecdotes about how, particularly for employment assistance programs, it's often difficult for citizens to complete forms correctly, and how frontline workers really only gain the necessary expertise to interpret policy after being in their roles for a decade or longer. Who do you see that's doing this well? And I guess this one's for Jen.
There's a lot of things that you can do about that environment, right? Certainly just sort of trying to tame the complexity and make it simpler. I just happen to be working today with a state in the US that's going to try to use an AI model to look at this very large volume of regulations that govern unemployment insurance in their state and see what the AI can suggest, not in control of, just suggest, about simplifications that might make that decade or more time to get up to speed a little bit shorter. I think that there are ways to tame the complexity, and I certainly want anybody who has the ability to do that to avail themselves of those tools. But I don't want to miss the opportunities to actually reduce that complexity. We happen to live at a time where now there are better tools for doing that. But what we're missing, I think, is the voice of the public servants who have to deal with, and in the case of unemployment insurance in one state, it's 7,119 pages of regulation. We need public servants' voices saying, couldn't this be a little bit simpler? You know what we would get from that? We would get a much more resilient system that didn't have such problems during the pandemic. It was really a sore point for us here in the US, that particular program. Yeah. But we have to ask for what we need.
It's so true. And frontline staff are just such an invaluable resource. They are the subject matter experts, sort of vicariously, for where the public runs into problems, because they're the ones answering the questions that we don't properly phrase on the forum, or giving the information and seeing where people fall down. So yeah, that's such an invaluable reminder to bring front counter staff, frontline staff, and the people they serve into this process at an early stage. I guess one for you, CJ, and this is coming from an audience member as well. How do we avoid the waterfall syndrome? This is something that Jen describes in her book, where staff are afraid of breaking free from standard processes in order to identify or solve process problems. CJ, do you have any advice for folks, as somebody who's had to do that herself quite a bit in your career?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're at a time when, modernizing government services isn't the realm of just the technology experts anymore. This is a competency and a responsibility that is embedded in all public servants. And And so when we think about things like the Digital Academy, so we are offering courses today for public servants in things like agile methodology and human-centered design. We've had about 3,000 public servants go through the Digital Academy so far. But I think we are at a time when delivering good services on behalf of the public service in the year 2024 means it's all of our responsibility to lean into that, to lean into new ways of working, to lean into our digital and data literacy, and making sure that we are thinking about the ways in which we deliver services differently and the ways in which we develop policy and the ways in which we lean into the framework of government that supports this kind of work. And that's all of our responsibility. It's not the government chief information officer's responsibility. It's not the tech people. It's all of us. And so it's a lift we can all do together.
Thank you. Well, this next question is for both of you. And you can tell we have some avid readers online because they're all mostly specifically referencing your book, Jen. So that's fantastic. As a strategy to avoid or move away from the accountability trap, which you also talk about, what specific steps have you taken or observed to shift from process-focused accountability to outcome-focused accountability? Can you give examples of where this shift has led to significant improvements in service delivery? Maybe just start too by talking about that accountability trap piece. So maybe we'll kick it off with you, Jen, first.
Yeah, I think part of why I wrote the book is to change our relationship with the public as well. I don't think they understand the ways in which we have put public servants in this trap. So the accountability trap is simply that most public servants are held accountable to a process that was designed often long ago, or certainly often, not by them. And the safe path for them in any given situation is to follow established procedure. But that often doesn't get the outcomes that the public expects, or in many cases, it doesn't get outcomes that the policy intended. And so you're stuck in a trap. Which do you do? And I think one of the things I'm trying to do is elevate that question so that more of our policymakers, our oversight bodies, and I would include in that the press, can understand that whenever they're covering an issue in government, they're probably covering an accountability trap issue. And that they might be able to shine more light on what's going on for the public by seeing it through this lens. We really need to reward the public servants who take the more difficult path, the courageous path of saying, I know it would be safe for me to follow this procedure, but I really need to get the right outcome for the public. And so I'm going to do this riskier thing. And one place to start with that, in my view, is our oversight bodies. If we spent half of our oversight muscle elevating public servants who'd made that choice and said, this is what we like, this is what we want, this is what good looks like. I'm not saying we pick the, couple of times where, somebody made a rash decision, but find those folks like the stories that I tell in the book and say, let's make sure we're letting the public service and the public know that we think this is what good looks like. I think we would see a change in culture. The way we have it right now, public servants know 7,000 ways to get in trouble, at least they do in the US. We have one program in the federal government that gives awards to public servants. I mean, there's certainly some in departments, but that's simply not enough. You get what you pay attention to, and our oversight bodies are finding flaws, which is fine and important, but they need to also be elevating the choices that public servants make at their own risk, sometimes to their career. Not only to thank them, but to send a message. And I know we'll talk about culture today, but I think culture changes in a lot of ways, and one way is by where we put our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And CJ, how have you seen that evolve in the public service in the time that you've been in your role? But also, where do we need to go? Are there specific things that, for example, people in my position and our deputy colleagues and ADM colleagues could be doing to better foster that kind of culture, the one that Jen described?
Oh, what an opportunity. I love this question. So, I mean, I've been in this role 6.5 years, and in that time, have we seen progress? Yes, absolutely. And, Jen, you talk about decision-making bodies or governance bodies. We have one here in the BC government called the Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data, and they make all of the decisions associated with IMIT funding for new projects coming forward. And we publish an annual report, and we have done in the last 4 years. So we're able to see real metrics and real progress across that period of time. So we know, for example, that 89% of the projects that were funded last year saw the intended benefits that they set out to achieve. We know that 78% of them used common components. We are seeing waterfall projects fall year over year. In 21-22, I believe it was 20% of our projects were built using waterfall methodology. That fell to just 9% last year. So we're able to track in very real ways the progress that we're making. And I would say overwhelmingly that governance body, the Deputy Ministers Committee of Digital and Data, is something I am asked more about than anything else BC is doing by my colleagues across Canada. Is how do we get one of those, and how can we begin making decisions like this? And so I think we're seeing very real progress, and we can track it over time. There's still more to do, of course. But I think BC is in a good place, and things like our digital plan and our digital code of practice outline in very real ways what good looks like and provides practical guidance and principles around things like designing with users and embedding accessibility. And those are beginning to take root, and we're seeing successes like, there are many success stories I know, Jen, that you tell. We are beginning to have some of those for ourselves here in BC, which is a really nice thing to be able to say.
It's very impressive.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. I think one of the things that maybe some viewers might be thinking about is, well, that all sounds well and good, but and of course, we all want to be following that user-centric process, but it does take time to do well. And
Sure.
Oftentimes we're under so much pressure, sometimes from my office, to deliver quickly and to implement quickly. I don't know if you've got any comments on that. I tend to think there are some aspects of that aren't actually mutually exclusive, and it's in that space where you can be fairly creative maybe and avoid some of the process challenges that you described, Jen. But have you seen that dynamic tension in your work, and have you seen examples where that's been sort of maybe not resolved? I don't know if it can ever be resolved, but balanced in a way that's really interesting.
You mean that sort of the speed?
Yeah, the tension between like
yeah.
quick delivery, pressure to implement, and the time we need to better understand people's needs as users and to make sure that we're bringing people along.
I think a great example of that from the U.S. is the program that we had at the beginning of the Biden administration to give out free COVID tests. So the president incoming promised to put up a website essentially called covidtest.gov, and the team had to deliver on that quite quickly. And I guess I have two things about it. One is that because tech teams were included from the very beginning of the discussion about what would happen, they were able to shape the essentially the requirements of the project. So there were so many things that could have gone into that little request form for your free COVID tests, and they said, we need to make some trade-offs here. I think one thing, a couple of things that are incredibly important is speed, accessibility to everyone. This is not a specialty project. This is, has really anybody in the country needs to be able to use it. That means lots of different languages. That means lots of different levels of digital literacy. And it needs to scale because it's going to have a lot of people on it at once. So if it needs to be those three things, then we can't ask a lot of questions. We can't have a lot of data integrations. We have to make some smart choices. And so what came out was just crazy simple for a government web form. It really just asked for your name and your address, and that was it. And I think in earlier times, there would have been much more of a push to ask a lot more questions, do a lot more data validation, and, maybe get, say, your insurance information. I know you have a different system in Canada. You don't need to brag about it. We have a terrible system here. Or your vaccination status, or whether you'd had COVID, and they said, no, we're going to keep it really, really simple. And that led to great speed. Now, it was not perfect. There was a problem in that if you lived in an apartment building and the post office hadn't kept up with the fact that your home years ago was a single family home and it had broken up into apartments, it had a trigger that if two people asked for these COVID tests from the same address, it would block the second person. So it was a very small number of apartment dwellers who essentially went on, but because somebody upstairs had already asked, they were told they couldn't have it. And this is an equity issue. Obviously, you're going to be looking at lower income folks generally, if you're looking at renters. But I think the lesson from that is that things are not perfect, and they were able to fix it very, very quickly. And I mean, within a day. And I think so often we hold back because we say we really want it to be perfect. And what we really want is to figure out what's wrong and fix it immediately. It's resilience and adaptation more than it is perfection. And I think that can help us get something out the door sooner. I'm not saying we rush something out the door that's just, disastrous for users. That's disrespectful. But I think if we have that capability behind the scenes to say, yeah, we got that. We fixed it. We have that capability. It's not a change order that has to go through 17 different sign-offs. It's just a team that can fix it. Then we have a lot more confidence to say, let's get this out the door. Let's let people start using it, and they're going to be happy in the long run. And people loved covidtest.gov. We got tweets everywhere. I mean, not. That team was just full of pride, and Twitter was full of praise because it was, the only service in the U.S. that took you about 11 seconds to apply for.
That is such a great example. There's so much to unpack there. And really, if you'd asked the public, would you have rather waited 6 months and have something near perfect? They needed those tests now, and your agility in being able to fix glitches in a day. The public's pretty forgiving of that. They understand that things aren't always going to be perfect, but what they appreciate is the simplicity and the respect for their time and the accessibility. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe CJ, chime in here too. I think we have a tendency in the public service to really want to manage risk down to zero.
Yes.
And to be fair, we deal with some real life and death issues. So there's areas definitely in our work where we don't want to take serious risks. There's a lot of stuff that we do, which is kind of like handing out COVID tests, where the downside of getting it wrong may be, some risk of fraud, but it's not a life or death situation. Can you talk about that? Is that a phenomenon that you've seen elsewhere? Because we know that the simpler the form is, the less documentation people need to provide, the more you're going to radically increase accessibility. We sometimes make choices to add complexity in order to ensure that there's not going to be any fraud, that we all have the proper accounting in place. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is that something that you see often? Are there jurisdictions managing that well?
I think that's a great, it's a great topic to invoke this issue of culture again. And I think it's not just the culture of each individual team, but the sense that the teams across government who touch something before it goes out the door are really part of a whole. Because when you say we can't take that risk here in our team, generally what's happening is that risk is getting pushed off to some other part of the process. And in the worst cases, it's really pushed all the way to the user. And that's not what anybody wants. We have to really look at it as a whole and say, what are we doing here and how is it going to affect our colleagues? If we take a little bit more risk here, that's going to speed the thing getting out the door. It's going to mean that users have less burden. It's going to mean that the other parts of this team aren't then dealing with the downsides of the choices that we made. And it's a problem in every bureaucracy. And one piece of feedback I've gotten over and over again is risk aversion is not limited to government. Of course, it's in every government I've ever talked to. I mean, it's part of the nature of public sector work. It happens in the private sector. It happens everywhere. So it's just not something that you're going to get rid of. But I do think it is mitigated when teams see the full picture, care about their fellow public servants, the other teams down the line, and really can all keep going back to what do we need to do for the user? Are we pushing this risk from us to the public? Do we really want that? No. Then how are we going to change how we're doing something?
CJ, I know you've got thoughts on this. Do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I would +1 all of that. I think where we saw great successes, I mean, I don't like to say great successes in the same sentence as COVID, but it was true that we were able to move mountains at speed, and that it really came down to multidisciplinary teams. We had multidisciplinary teams wrapped around a problem that we were trying to solve. And it was those teams that were really the rocket fuel of what we achieved in COVID. I would say we certainly see risk aversion, and so does, I think all of my colleagues across Canada would agree with me that is a cultural element of public sector that we see everywhere. I think where we've had some success in addressing risk aversion would be in starting small and looking at incremental improvements, designing with users, and just one better service experience at a time, and just start small and keep going. So I would +1 everything Jen said, and certainly where we've seen success has been along those lines.
That multidisciplinary team is such an important part of it, because then you really break down that sense that, well, some other team's going to have to deal with it. We don't know them. Again, it's a collapsing that distance, and I think that is so much the key to better outcomes. I really applaud you for that.
Great. Well, we know multidisciplinary teams are sort of one ingredient if you're trying to kind of create the perfect circumstances where innovation can be generated. Another question we have online for you, Jen, have you seen best practices for enabling innovation within an organization? And particularly the question is getting at bottom-up innovation. How do we incubate that? How do we support it? How do we grow it? The questioner didn't say this, but I'm going to paraphrase. How do we make sure we're not crushing the spirits of people who are bringing that kind of innovation and enthusiasm and creativity to their work by virtue of the structures that we've created that have kind of created this risk aversion and process dominated mentality? So do you have some best practices there? How can we support people to be innovative, to take risks, to be creative?
I think that it's not so much what you say, but it's what people observe. So if they see that a colleague has an idea and there's a forum for it to be expressed and potentially acted on, then they're gonna do the same. And so you really have to walk the talk. I think it also needs to you need to sort of practice product management in that too, right? Like find the right forums and have a way that the best ideas sort of get run, tested, not just sort of letting everybody, pile on, we need this, because you can end up with a bit of a patchwork quilt. But I do think it does come down to a tone of leadership, which in the US, I would criticize us for that tone, setting the expectation that the important work gets done at the policy level and that everybody does the implementation is sort of an afterthought. I think when we change that and we say, no, because you are on the front lines, things that people above you don't know. We need that information. That is critical, in fact, necessary for our build, measure, learn cycle. You are part of our strategy, even if you're not in the strategy team, right? that leadership that not just says that, but actually does it and shows it will create an environment for innovation. But I'm not running big teams these days. I'd really love to hear what CJ has to say about this.
Well, so I would say we are on a trajectory where it's getting better. When I started in this role, I used to actually tell my staff that how you knew you were innovating was when your work felt really, really hard, when the policies of government didn't fit you, and when you went to meetings and everybody kind of looked at you with a scowly face and started with the word no. 6.5 years in, it's getting better. And BC took an approach where we thought about the work of innovation in government and the ways in which that work got supported. So we modernized the core policy manual. We created a digital plan. We have a digital code of practice. We looked at HR policy. We looked at the way we invested in IT. And so we slowly picked away at all of the levers that support this work and tried to create a framework that was more modern in terms of how the work of innovation got done. And so, but I think there's more to do and more that goes with that, right? Like a risk aversion exists within a culture where, nobody wants to make a mistake. And so, when you live in a government public service system where you're responsible for public funds, there's not a lot of room for error. And so creating a culture where it's okay to try something, where it's okay to iterate, where it's okay to speak truth to power, those are important ingredients if you want to drive innovation and you want to drive culture change. And so that's what we have strived for in the Office of the Chief Information Officer. I think we've made some good positive impact. There's certainly more to do. But I think, I've heard Shannon speak at Corporate Executive. I've heard her talk about leaning in and being innovative and thinking differently and vulnerable and authentic leadership. All of those things are good cultural signals that the BC government is interested in a more modern path and a more modern way of developing services for citizens. And that's all incredibly positive. It's partly what makes BC the envy of other jurisdictions in Canada, is that we have that in our leadership right now.
Thanks, CJ. It's been interesting for me because I came into core government only fairly recently. I'm going to keep saying that for a few more months, and then it'll be a ridiculous thing to say. You get 2 years, right? I'll keep using it for a bit. But so I kind of came in with a naive sort of certainty that everyone could just speak freely and say what they thought as long as they were saying that in a respectful way, and I'm a person who firmly believes that you can always find a respectful way to say anything you need to say, but that it hasn't always been the case. And I've been in rooms with public servants where sometimes comments are prefaced by, and where this might be a career limiting comment or some anxiety that almost implies retribution. And it reminds me that big organizations like ours, there are some shadows that loom large, that the hierarchy can make it really challenging to do exactly what, Jen, you advocate in your book that we need to do, and what you've just articulated, which is bringing everybody into that decision-making process, making it comfortable for them. Have you seen best practices when you're operating in a large, fairly hierarchical organization, how we can create the kind of safety for people to enable them to be creative, to toss out ideas that maybe haven't been fully fleshed out and costed yet, but to create safety for that kind of exchange of ideas?
CJ, do you want to start with that one, or?
Yeah, certainly for either of you, or both.
Well, one of the things I would say is I think working in the open matters. And whether that's developing policy, I mean, we've developed our the AI interim guidance that way. We developed our digital code of practice that way. I recently received a photo from a colleague from Ottawa who was attending a lecture, and the lecture was happening in Taiwan in Cantonese. But up on the screen was a photo of BC's procurement approaches, our team with us, our code with us, our sprint with us. And so working in the open matters because it creates an ecosystem that exists outside the walls of government. So there's this nice outside in sort of synergy that begins to happen because citizens need services that government delivers, yes, but they also need services that exist outside the walls of government. And when you have an ecosystem that citizens can participate in as part of the digital economy that exists in both places, it begins to, light itself on fire and expand in ways that are unexpected. We have digital credentials that we use here in BC, and it became known to us that the city of Vancouver was using them so that small business owners could have digital credentials and create online interactions that they would have otherwise only, at front counter experiences of. And so when you have open source code and you have open source and you work in the open, you begin to create the beginnings of an ecosystem that can exist, whether it's a government-funded, government-sponsored, government resource project or not. And I think when you have that kind of ecosystem that begins to develop, then you're onto something really, really powerful.
Yeah, I think openness is absolutely key. Another best practice that I would offer is the blameless postmortems that you see in lots of companies. It's pretty hard to practice them in government, but I do see them, coming into the space. When something goes wrong, if everybody starts to point fingers at each other, it's just deadly for culture. Especially if you're trying to say we actually need to be able to be resilient, not perfect. It's just, it's completely counter to that. So a blameless postmortem, and by the way, there's clear way, methods of doing this, not just an idea, but, look it up online and you'll see some suggestions of how to actually run a blameless postmortem. Really say, if we had a failure, it was by definition a system failure. And that's always the case. You might have had a person make a mistake, but they made a mistake in the context of a system that needs to be looked at. And it really builds a culture that not only can recover quickly, but then has the effect that you were asking for, which is reminding folks and showing folks that they're will be valued, and their feedback in a blameless postmortem is absolutely necessary, and their feedback outside of an emergency will absolutely be valued, and that we're again all in this together and not pointing fingers at each other.
Yeah, that's a great practice to take away. I think we've started to do some of that, but there's an opportunity to really, I think, work on a kind of a tried and true methodology. So I will take you up on your suggestion to Google and find out more. We've got a few questions that I'll just kind of squish into one about accessibility and the role of technology in that. One part of the question was, how have you seen technology and the sort of what good looks like in terms of increasing accessibility for people, but also how do we manage to serve the needs of people who will never be really comfortable online? In other words, how do we have a sort of multi-channel process that by definition will require some duplication, some parallel processes? And have you seen that, I guess, being done well in your work? What are some things that we need to keep in mind? How do you think about that in terms of how you meet people where they are? And then CJ, maybe I'll hand it over to you to talk about how the OCIO approaches that question.
As the granddaughter of a 100-year-old woman whose Medicare I have to handle, I am very aware of the difficulties that folks with low digital literacy have. The world is now really made for folks who can do things quickly online, and it's quite uncomfortable when that's just not what you grew up with. The best services take the paperwork out and put the people up front, right? So we're trying to save time, streamline, make things easier, not so that we can have, no public servants and, be a lean, streamlined organization as if we'd been bought by a private equity firm, but because we want people to be on the front lines helping people. And we take those resources and move them into both the user research that's going to make it easier for people and bring, move that line of sort of low digital literacy. There are services that are so simple that those, that my grandmother can use at 100. but also put resources where they are appropriate for appropriate interactions. And that's often going to mean in person or over the phone. We've got to staff those. But if this public servant using a simple service, if it's easier on them, they're going to also be able to help more people. CJ was just talking about some, great inspiration, overseas inspiration, people inspired by work in BC. I've been inspired by work in Bangladesh, where they have just done an incredible job of, again, both simplifying the services, not just taking the processes they had and make them digital, but doing the work to take out the parts that were unnecessary, and then establish a network of offices that people can go to get their government services, where there is literally somebody filling out the form on the computer for them, because it's just not, that is absolutely necessary given the population of Bangladesh. We should be following Bangladesh's model in providing access to those who don't have the kind of setup that I have at home: broadband internet and a good computer. It's not everybody.
That's for sure. CJ?
Yeah, I mean, I think I come from the Ministry of Citizen Services, so we are roommates with our Service BC colleagues who have 65 offices across the province and do front counter services for a myriad of government services, from COVID vaccine booking to preparedness for emergency management and driver's license renewal and everything in between. And so I think we know that there's a cadre of citizenry that don't want to receive necessarily all of their services in digital format. And so designing with that in mind, I think, is important. In the OCIO, there's a number of tools that we have for people who are looking and thinking about accessibility when they're designing services. Things like we have a writing for the web plain language training course. So making sure that as you're putting out communications on the web, you're doing that in plain language and in ways that are the simplest version that you can describe. We have digital.gov.bc.ca, which has the web content accessibility guidelines. That's helpful for people in terms of writers, designers, developers of these services. And digital.gov.bc.ca has a number of ever-growing resources. There's a community of practice that continues to add to that content. And there's a number of success stories. There's communities of practice. So I think we are growing our digital dexterity when we're thinking of new services that government offers. Our digital code of practice, for example, has a principle in it that says design with people and embed inclusion. And so I think we are thinking about these things as we go. And do we have to raise the digital and data literacy of all public servants? Yes, that is work that we need to do, and it's work we're embarking on now. But I think we've made some important steps in the right direction, and it's something we have to continue to consider. And when we put out information in government, often we're putting it out in a multi-language format. And so BC, I think, does a pretty good job in that space, but is there more we can do? Yes, absolutely. And we will continue to strive for that. But it's something we iterate on as we go.
Thanks, CJ. And we'll make sure that those resources that you've just talked about are in the notes when we send out the episode as well. So thank you for those. It seems to me that one of the real gifts of that multi-channel approach is that you let people who are fine with a well-designed web app or web form run ahead and do their thing. And that really does free up very finite, increasingly finite staff, human resources to really tend and ideally offer a more bespoke service to people who really need it. So we see that often and over and over in government, where we kind of make everybody line up through the same queue. But if we can do that early triaging based on their choice and preferences, we have a huge opportunity space to increase service for everyone, I think. And I think that's was a couple of the themes that you've teased out there. I know we're running a bit short now on time, so this hour has flown. We've gone to a number of the questions. I'm going to just read out one last one because I think it's a good place to close. This person says, Jen, I feel so seen while reading your book, and I also feel extremely hopeful. For those of us aspiring to make a positive impact in government or civic tech, what advice do you have to stay hopeful and persistent despite the challenges? And I think that's a good question to leave us with. So maybe I'll open up to you, CJ, first, and then we'll turn it over to Jen.
Sure. I mean, for me, I think people come to the public service. I think public service is a calling, and people come to the public service because they want to make life better for people. And I haven't met a public servant that is, deliberately trying to make something complicated. But I mean, I like the word seen. I feel the same. I feel seen when I go through Jen's book. And I think this work is incredibly hard, but incredibly rewarding. And so, I too feel a sort of a sense of hopefulness when I read this, and I feel a bit validated that governments everywhere are dealing with this, that it is absolutely as hard as it feels some days, and validated that in terms of some of the approaches that BC has taken have been absolutely the right approach in terms of thinking our way through the levers that support the work, rather than just coming up with the technology plan, because technology is often the easiest part. And so I think, I would encourage people on the call to check out the digital plan, check out the digital code of practice on digital.gov.bc.ca, join a community of practice, check out the Digital Academy. And, I think we are all in this together. So help us lift. We have a ways to go, but we're certainly on the right path. And it's great work to be doing. So I just want to thank you, Jen, for your book and for coming and having the conversation with us today.
Jen,
thank you.
Any words of advice for hopeful and rejuvenated, it sounds like, public servant, thanks to your book?
It really feeds my soul to hear that. As you know, the inscription is to public servants everywhere, don't give up. And when people tell me that they are reinvigorated or hopeful after reading the book, my heart just sings. That's what I live for. So thank you for sharing that. If I have other advice besides don't give up, I think it would be three things. First would be celebrate. We have to celebrate our wins. They're hard days doing these jobs. And if we don't really stop when we hit a milestone or have a win of any kind and high five each other, we just don't have the energy when we hit one of those hard days. My friends in the GDS in the UK used to say that cake was one of their secret weapons. They would just have cake pretty often to celebrate things. And I prefer ice cream over cake, but I see the point. And I would, whatever it is that floats your boat, make sure that you and your team celebrate. The second thing I would say is to tell your stories. I mean, I'm shocked that nobody wrote a book like Recoding America before. I mean, these are amazing stories of amazing people, and there's millions more like them. And public servants need to be a little louder about what they're doing, about what's going on, and don't sanitize it. CJ was talking about plain language. That's really important. And it's also important to actually tell the crazy little details and bring it to life. What is it that this team is doing? What are you fighting against? Sure, there's a lot of constraints in our way. People are interested much more than we've given the public credit for. So however you can, tell your story. Sometimes just get a friend and tell them about the project you've just done in as great detail as you can, because it's much more interesting than people have led you to believe. And I guess the last thing is just community. I talked about those hard days. I had them when I was in public service. Every public servant I know has had them. And the way you get through them and come back to have another day and then have a great success, which makes you happy that you didn't leave, is that you go to someone who will see you and will support you. and know who those people are and cultivate them and be that person for someone else. Because ultimately, the work is hard. As CJ said, you're not innovating unless it's hard. It's hard, and we need to support each other. So build and be part of and support your community.
Great advice. So celebrate, tell your stories, build community. I think those are excellent words of wisdom. I was going to mention the inscription because it really spoke to me as well. To public servants, don't give up. I think one thing that comes through in your book loud and clear is the deep respect and appreciation you have for your former colleagues, but also for public servants in all these jurisdictions that you draw on. So just huge thanks. Thanks for giving us a voice as well. And I think like so many others, I really saw myself in your book too. So grateful that you made time for us today, Jen, and CJ. I know how busy you are as well. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much to the audience for tuning in and for being so engaged. I don't think we got to all the questions, but we did make a good dent on them. So thank you for that. I think this was a really great hour well spent. I feel really hopeful as well. So thank you both again for that. I'm going to be sending out a recording of this program in the next few days. And as I mentioned, we'll make sure that we have links not only to Jen's book, although again, many of you seem to have already read it, but also to the links that CJ mentioned and ideally some of the examples that Jen mentioned too. So thank you both again. Thanks everyone for tuning in and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. It was really an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Jen.
Bye.